A soldier stands at 17,000 feet, breath freezing in front of his face, and he is holding a stick, not a rifle, not a grenade launcher. A wooden club, wrapped in barbed wire, because that is what the treaty allows him to carry. Behind him, spread across some of the most brutal terrain on the planet, are thousands of men just like him. Soldiers from 2 of the only 9 nuclear-armed nations on Earth, standing face to face, forbidden from firing a single shot. This is not a joke. This is not a relic from some ancient war before gunpowder. This is happening right now, on a border shared by 2 countries that together hold more nuclear warheads than every country in Europe combined. And when these men fight, and they do fight, they fight with fists, with rocks, with clubs studded with nails. Men have died up here, not from bullets, from blunt trauma, from hypothermia after being beaten and left in sub-zero temperatures, from falling off cliffs during nighttime brawls at altitudes where the human body can barely function. Ask yourself the obvious question: how does this happen? How do 2 nuclear superpowers, each capable of ending civilization, end up settling their most dangerous disagreement with the same weapons a medieval peasant might have used to defend a field? The answer is that both sides are terrified of exactly one thing, and it's not each other's army. It's an accident. A single gunshot in a valley this remote, this silent, could echo for kilometers. A patrol hearing that echo might assume they're under attack. They might return fire. And then, thousands of nuclear-armed troops packed into narrow mountain valleys could find themselves in a shooting war that neither government ordered and neither government can stop once it starts. So they made a pact. No guns, no explosives. Nothing that could be mistaken for the first shot of a war neither side can afford. And in the vacuum that Pact created, something almost prehistoric took root. A modern border conflict fought hand to hand, fist to fist, on a roof of the world where the air is so thin that a sprint of 30 meters can leave a trained soldier gasping. This is one of the most dangerous unresolved standoffs on the planet, and almost nobody outside the region understands why it exists, or why it refuses to end. Because this isn't really a fight about a few kilometers of frozen rock. It's the visible edge of something far larger. A rivalry between the 2 most populous nations on Earth, a third of all humanity, wrestling for power across trade routes, oceans, and the entire architecture of the emerging world order. The border is just where you can see it happen, where the abstraction of geopolitics becomes something you can touch. A man, a club, a mountain, and a line that isn't even fully drawn. To understand why soldiers are still swinging clubs at each other in the year 2026, you have to go back to a moment when these 2 countries weren't rivals at all, when they called each other brothers, when the line between them barely existed because there was something else in between them entirely. Imagine walking for weeks through snow passes so high that the air itself becomes an enemy, fleeing on foot with nothing but what you can carry. Because staying home means risking capture by a foreign army. That is exactly what one man did, and when he crossed into a neighboring country, exhausted and stripped of his home, he set off a chain of events that would define one of the tensest borders on Earth. But rewind further, because it wasn't always destined to end this way. There was a time when these 2 nations called each other brothers. Both had emerged from colonial rule within a few years of one another, both proud, both determined to build something new, and both convinced they could coexist peacefully as neighbors. They signed agreements promising exactly that. Peaceful coexistence, they called it, with genuine warmth behind the words. Diplomats from both sides stood shoulder to shoulder at international gatherings, positioning themselves as leaders of a new, post-colonial world. And for a while, that peace held helped along by something neither side fully appreciated at the time: a buffer. A vast, remote, high-altitude region that separated them so completely that these two giants had almost no direct contact at all. A place of monasteries and nomadic herders ruled by a spiritual leader believed to be a reincarnation of his predecessors, with its own language, its own identity, and its own quiet desire to remain independent from everyone. That buffer didn't last. A newly empowered government to the north viewed this high plateau as unfinished business, strategic ground that had to be secured before anyone else could get ideas about it. So soldiers moved in. They promised the local population they could keep governing themselves. For a while, an uneasy peace held even there. But promises like that rarely survive contact with military occupation. As more troops arrived, the population began to sense the difference between what they'd been promised and what was actually happening to their culture, their autonomy, their future. Fear spread that their spiritual leader might be captured. And so, in a moment of desperation, resistance fighters rose up against a force they had no realistic chance of defeating conventionally. A resistance that, quietly, found sympathy and support from a distant superpower with its own reasons to oppose the government to the north. It was in the chaos of that failed uprising that one man made the walk that opened this block, crossing mountain passes on foot, evading capture, arriving exhausted at the border of the neighboring country to the south, and being welcomed in. That single act of granting refuge to a fleeing spiritual leader did something no treaty, no diplomatic statement, no economic agreement could undo. It told the government to the north, in the clearest possible terms, that its southern neighbor was not a passive bystander, that it was willing to shelter the very symbol of resistance against their rule. Tens of thousands of refugees followed in the following years, and they're still there today, in a small mountain town, still asserting a claim to lead a homeland they can no longer freely enter. From the northern government's perspective, this wasn't hospitality, it was betrayal. Proof, in their eyes, that their southern neighbor was colluding with outside powers to undermine their sovereignty, to encourage separatism, to chip away at territory they considered non-negotiable. The buffer was gone. The two countries that had called each other brothers just years earlier were now standing face to face, with nothing between them but a border that had never been properly drawn, running through some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Peaceful coexistence had lasted less than a decade. What came next wouldn't be diplomatic tension. It would be war. Picture soldiers dying not from enemy fire, but from the cold itself, men sent into some of the highest, most oxygen-starved terrain on Earth with summer uniforms, inadequate boots, and ammunition that would run out within days. They weren't losing to a stronger enemy. They were losing to unpreparedness, to an assumption that this fight would never actually come. It came anyway, and it came fast. 3 years after two nations had promised each other peaceful coexistence, they were firing artillery at one another across some of the most punishing mountain terrain in the world. And underneath that war was a problem that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with cartography. Because parts of this border had never actually been agreed upon by the people who had to live on either side of it. Some of the most contested stretches trace back to a line drawn by a British colonial official more than a century earlier. A line neither side had ever fully accepted, sketched onto a map by someone who would never have to defend it. When war broke out, one side was catastrophically unprepared. Troops were rushed to altitudes above 5,000 meters without proper acclimatization, without winter equipment, without the logistics to keep them supplied. The other side had spent years building roads and infrastructure specifically for this kind of high-altitude campaign. The result wasn't really a contest. It was a rout, and it happened in a matter of weeks. For the country that lost, this wasn't just a military defeat. It became something closer to a national wound. A humiliation that would shape how an entire generation of leaders and citizens viewed their more powerful neighbor. Territory changed hands. Trust, already fragile, collapsed entirely. And the countries that had once called each other brothers now viewed one another through a lens of suspicion that has never fully lifted. Not in the decades since, not today. This is the moment that created the border as we now understand it, not a single agreed line, but a patchwork of disputed zones stretching across thousands of kilometers, each claimed differently by each side. Each populated by people who go about their lives on land two governments insist belongs to them. And here's the detail most people miss. There is almost nothing of practical value in most of this disputed territory. No industry. No agriculture worth fighting over. Vast stretches of it are barren, freezing, uninhabitable cold desert. You could hand either government the entire disputed area tomorrow, and it would barely register on their GDP. So why does it matter so much? Because for both nations, this territory stopped being about resources a long time ago. It became about identity. Both countries carry a historical memory of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers, colonization, unequal treaties, forced concessions of territory during periods of national weakness. Giving up land now, even worthless land, even barren rock at 17,000 feet, feels to both governments like repeating that historical humiliation all over again. Neither can afford, politically or psychologically, to be the one who backs down. That's what turned a border dispute into something closer to a permanent condition. Something neither side is trying to solve so much as manage, indefinitely, generation after generation. And managing it meant putting more and more soldiers on that line, which meant more chances for a patrol to stumble into another patrol, which meant, eventually, that both governments would have to answer a terrifying question. What happens when these young men guarding land that produces nothing, staring at an enemy across a line nobody agrees on, actually come face to face? They found out the answer decades later. And when they did, it changed how this entire border would function from that point forward. Somewhere in these mountains, a soldier hears gunfire echo across a valley and has no idea whether it's the beginning of an accident or the beginning of a war. That single moment of uncertainty, that terrifying ambiguity, is the reason this entire border operates the way it does today. It's the reason men up here fight with sticks instead of rifles. And to understand why, you have to understand what changed after that humiliating war settled into an uneasy, permanent standoff. Both countries kept building their militaries, kept fortifying the line, and then, within a couple of decades of each other, both countries did something that changed the entire calculation of what could happen if a clash on this border ever spiraled out of control. Both went nuclear. Suddenly, this wasn't just a border dispute between two large regional powers. It was a border dispute between two nuclear states, standing face to face, in terrain so remote and so poorly mapped that a single miscommunication could plausibly be mistaken for an act of war. Military planners on both sides understood the mathematics of that risk immediately. A firefight at altitude, in a place with almost no reliable communication, could escalate faster than either government could control it. Nobody wanted a repeat of the war from decades earlier. Nobody wanted that war fought with nuclear-capable arsenals in play. So in the 1990s, both governments did something almost unheard of in modern military history. They agreed not to use firearms or explosives within 2 kilometers of their disputed line. Think about what that actually means in practice. 2 of the largest militaries on the planet, guarding a border they still can't agree on, are legally and diplomatically forbidden from bringing their actual firepower anywhere near the line of contact. It was a genuinely clever piece of crisis management, Remove the guns, and you remove the fuse that could turn an accident into a nuclear-adjacent war. For years, it mostly worked, largely because the terrain itself did a lot of the deterring. Operating a serious military campaign at these altitudes, in this cold, across this kind of ground, was brutally difficult. The mountains were doing what diplomacy couldn't always guarantee. But that only lasted as long as neither side could actually get up there in force. By the early 2000s, both economies were growing fast, integrating into global trade, generating the kind of wealth that funds serious infrastructure. And where there's wealth, there's construction. Roads cut into mountainsides, tunnels blasted through solid rock, airstrips carved onto plateaus that had never seen sustained human presence before. What had once been remote, nearly unreachable high ground was slowly becoming accessible year-round. One side moved faster and further than the other. Decades ago, the mountainous region at the heart of this dispute had only a few thousand kilometers of road. Today it has well over 100,000. Infrastructure expanding at a pace of roughly 5 kilometers of new road every single day for decades running. Villages sprang up directly along the contested line, populated with financial incentives from the government, explicitly framed as defenders of sacred national territory. Hundreds of these settlements went up in just the past several years alone. On the other side of the line, the response has been smaller in scale, but just as deliberate. Tunnels blasted through solid mountain to keep roads open through winters that used to cut off entire regions for months. New airstrips, new bases, an attempt to match infrastructure investment without the same depth of resources. None of this was built explicitly for war. Most of it serves ordinary civilian and economic purposes: trade, tourism, connecting remote populations to the rest of the country. But infrastructure like this has a dual nature that neither government can fully separate from its military implications. A road built for a trading town is also a road that can move an armored convoy. A tunnel built to keep a mountain pass open in winter is also a tunnel that keeps troops supplied when they'd otherwise be cut off by snow. And once that infrastructure exists, one thing follows almost automatically. Soldiers start showing up in places soldiers had never been able to reach before. More soldiers, more patrols, more opportunities for two patrols from two nuclear-armed nations, forbidden from carrying real weapons, to find themselves standing face to face on a piece of frozen ground that both governments claim as their own. Which is exactly what happened. Repeatedly, and in one instance, it happened badly enough to produce the first combat deaths on this border in nearly half a century. It happened in darkness, at an altitude where the body is already fighting just to function, in freezing temperatures, on terrain so treacherous that men on both sides fell to their deaths simply trying to retreat. No gunfire, no artillery. And yet by the time the sun came up, dozens of soldiers were dead. The worst single loss of life on this border in nearly half a century. Here's how a fight like this actually unfolds, according to soldiers and analysts who've studied it closely. It rarely starts as a battle. It starts as a disagreement over where, exactly, a patrol is allowed to stand, because the two sides don't agree on where the line even is in the first place. A patrol from one side crosses into territory the other considers theirs. Words are exchanged, then shoving, then fists. Then someone remembers the barbed wire. Soldiers on this border have been documented wrapping metal spikes and barbed wire around wooden clubs, turning basic melee weapons into something that can tear flesh and crush bone, all while staying technically within the letter of an agreement that bans firearms and explosives. It's a chilling workaround. Obey the treaty precisely, while making the alternative weapon as brutal as possible. In the incident that shocked both nations, soldiers fought hand-to-hand for hours in total darkness, at an altitude close to 15,000 feet, in temperatures far below freezing. Some men were beaten unconscious and left exposed to the cold for hours before anyone could reach them, meaning a share of the fatalities weren't from the blows themselves, but from hypothermia afterward. Others lost their footing on unstable, icy ground during the chaos and fell into ravines that swallowed them in darkness. One side eventually confirmed a small number of its own soldiers had died. The other side's losses were reported to be significantly higher, though the full toll was never fully disclosed to the public. For a moment, the entire region held its breath. This was the first bloodshed on this border, since before either country had built the infrastructure now crisscrossing these mountains, since before both had gone nuclear. The fear that had justified the No Firearms Pact in the first place, those valleys, that echo, that risk of catastrophic misread, suddenly felt very real. And yet, remarkably, it didn't spiral into the war both sides had spent decades trying to prevent. What followed instead was one of the more understated diplomatic efforts of the past several years. Dozens of rounds of military-level talks, painstaking and largely invisible to the outside world, aimed at pulling troops back from the specific flashpoints where the clash and subsequent standoffs had occurred. It took years. Progress came in fits and starts, with long stretches where the two sides couldn't even agree on basic terms for de-escalation. Entire patrol routes remained frozen, sometimes literally under buffer zone restrictions that barred either side from patrolling contested points at all, a kind of mutual retreat neither government wanted to call a concession. Eventually, after years of negotiation, both sides reached a more complete arrangement. Patrols would be allowed to resume in the last unresolved flashpoints, but under conditions neither side had ever accepted before the clash. Patrol sizes capped, advance notice required before entering contested ground, a strict limit on how many patrols could even happen each month. It was presented publicly as normalization. In practice, it was something closer to a mutual admission that neither side trusted the other enough to patrol freely anymore. This is the strange, quiet equilibrium that exists on this border today. Not war, not peace. A carefully choreographed standoff, governed by rules neither side particularly likes. Maintained because the alternative, a genuine escalation between two nuclear powers, is a risk neither government is willing to run. But here's what almost nobody outside the region understands. This border was never really the whole story. It's the most visible symptom of a much bigger rivalry, one being fought not with clubs and patrol routes, but with trade routes, ports, warships, and economic leverage stretching from these frozen mountains all the way across an entire ocean. That's where this story goes next. Somewhere in a factory far from any mountain pass, a worker assembles a component that will end up inside a smartphone, a solar panel, a piece of medical equipment, manufactured in the very country its own government treats as the most dangerous military threat it faces. That's the contradiction sitting underneath this entire rivalry, and it's a far stranger one than anything happening on the border. These two nations, staring each other down across a disputed line where soldiers still fight with sticks, are also each other's economic lifelines. For decades, that wasn't true at all. For most of their modern history, these two countries barely traded with one another. That began changing only when one economy opened itself up to global markets and capitalism, and the other started modernizing its own domestic economy in parallel. Trade between them exploded from almost nothing into one of the most significant commercial relationships either country has. On paper, this should be reassuring. There's a well-known idea in international relations that countries deeply intertwined economically are less likely to go to war with each other. Too much to lose. too much shared prosperity at stake. And there is real substance to that here. One side sells the other electronics, machinery, textiles, pharmaceutical ingredients, industrial equipment, the unglamorous building blocks that keep a modern economy running day to day. The other side sells back raw materials, iron ore, minerals, chemicals, and finished goods of its own. Between them, close to a third of the entire human population is wrapped up in this exchange. But split that trade relationship apart by direction, and a very different picture appears. One side sells vastly more to the other than it buys back, a trade imbalance so severe that the weaker side in this exchange has become deeply, structurally dependent on a country it considers its primary military rival. The bulk of that imbalance flows in one direction, year after year, creating a form of economic vulnerability that has nothing to do with tariffs or trade wars in the news cycle, and everything to do with a much older, much more permanent structural reality. One economy simply cannot function without components, materials, and manufactured goods sourced from the country it fears militarily. That kind of dependency doesn't stay purely economic for long. It becomes leverage. When border tensions spike, both governments have shown they're willing to weaponize this relationship rather than let it remain untouched. One side has moved to restrict digital platforms and technology investment from the other, citing data security and sovereignty concerns, cutting off popular consumer apps and scrutinizing incoming capital. The other side holds a different kind of leverage entirely, control over critical raw materials and industrial inputs the global economy depends on, materials that can be slowed or restricted with a single policy decision, quietly reminding its trading partner exactly how much power flows through that imbalance. Neither government actually wants this. A genuine trade rupture would hurt both economies badly, and given how enormous both markets are, neither side benefits from tearing that relationship apart. But that's precisely what makes this dangerous. An economic relationship this valuable, this asymmetric, and this easily converted into a pressure tactic, isn't stable. It's a lever sitting there, waiting to be pulled whenever tensions on that frozen border start rising again. So this is the paradox at the center of the whole rivalry. The same two countries who cannot trust each other with rifles at 17,000 feet are simultaneously bound together by supply chains, factories, and manufacturing dependencies that neither can walk away from without real economic pain. And if you think that tension stays contained to trade routes and factory floors, you'd be wrong. Because that same imbalance of power has pushed both countries out into open water, into an ocean that one side considers its own backyard, and the other has been steadily, deliberately moving into. A cargo ship slips through a narrow strait, barely wide enough for two vessels to pass, carrying oil that will keep an entire national economy running for another day. If that strait ever closed, through conflict, piracy, or a single miscalculation, the country on the other end wouldn't feel it in weeks. It would feel it within days. That's the reality sitting beneath one of the least visible fronts in this entire rivalry. An ocean that one nation considers its natural domain, and the other has spent the last 2 decades quietly, methodically moving into. For the country that borders it directly, this ocean isn't just water. It's the artery its entire economy breathes through. The overwhelming majority of its trade and the vast bulk of its crude oil arrive by sea, funneled through a handful of narrow choke points vulnerable to piracy, instability, and the political whims of the smaller nations that happen to sit beside them. Losing safe passage through those choke points isn't a hypothetical inconvenience. It's closer to an existential threat. But that same ocean matters just as much to the rival power to the north. whose economy depends just as heavily on ships moving safely along these same routes to reach markets and energy supplies across the world. So, as that northern power's economy grew wealthier and more globally integrated, its navy began showing up further and further from home. First, in its own immediate waters, then gradually pushing out across this entire ocean, thousands of kilometers from its own coastline, embedding itself along trade routes it now considers essential to protect. This didn't happen through invasion or conquest. It happened through infrastructure, ports, railways, highways, energy pipelines, financed and built with loans and investment flowing outward to dozens of countries ringing this ocean. Framed publicly as commercial development, purely about trade and economic growth. And for the most part, that framing is accurate. These aren't military bases in disguise. They're genuine commercial ports serving genuine commercial ships. But infrastructure funded by a foreign government rarely stays purely commercial in the eyes of the country, watching it happen next door. Naval vessels from the investing power have docked at some of these ports without the kind of advance notice regional neighbors used to expect. At least one facility came with loan terms severe enough that failure to repay would have handed over the lease of the entire port to the lending government, a case widely described as debt trap diplomacy. Though many analysts who study the relationship argue that framing oversimplifies what's actually a more transactional, opportunistic pattern of investment rather than a deliberate strategy to seize territory. Whatever the intent, the effect has been unmistakable. A string of ports and investments ringing an ocean that one country has always considered its own sphere of influence, built and financed by the one rival it trusts least. Military planners in the affected country coined a term for the pattern years ago. A string of pearls, they called it, encircling their coastline one port at a time. Pearls, as one analyst dryly put it, look a lot less charming if you happen to be the oyster. So the response has been to build outward too. New naval bases positioned near the ocean's key choke points. Airstrips extended onto remote islands far from the mainland. Access secured to ports on foreign shores through diplomatic partnerships rather than direct investment. And because matching a wealthier rival's spending is impossible alone, an entire web of alliances has formed instead. Regular joint naval exercises with a small coalition of like-minded powers, all sharing one unspoken concern about where this ocean is heading. None of this looks like war. There are no battles fought here, no clubs, no barbed wire. But it is, in every meaningful sense, a competition for control, over trade routes, over energy security, over which power gets to decide what happens in waters that both consider critical to their survival. And this ocean is only one piece of a far larger board, because this rivalry doesn't just play out on a mountain border or across open water. It plays out across the entire architecture of global power, in a shifting alliance system where neither country fits neatly into any camp at all. Picture a nation forced to make an impossible calculation: anger the neighbor it depends on economically, or anger the partner it depends on militarily, or anger the power it depends on for its global rise, knowing that satisfying any one of them risks provoking the other two. That is the position one of these two countries has found itself in, again and again, for the better part of a century. And it explains something crucial about why this rivalry never resolves into a clean, simple story of two enemies facing off. Because the Southern power in this relationship has never fit neatly into any global camp. Decades ago, when the world split into two ideological blocs during a prolonged global standoff between capitalist and communist powers, this nation refused to join either side. It declared itself deliberately independent of both, helping found an entire movement of nations that rejected the idea that every country on Earth had to pick a superpower patron. But independence never meant isolation. Even while proclaiming neutrality, this country quietly bought weapons and equipment from whichever major power offered the best deal at the time, accepting support from multiple sides simultaneously without binding itself permanently to any of them. That pattern never really went away. It just evolved as the world around it changed. Today, one distant power remains this country's largest single supplier of military hardware, and simultaneously, one of its most important sources of energy, even as much of the rest of the world has cut that same power off economically over its recent military aggression elsewhere. Meanwhile, the country's economic and technological rise has become deeply entangled with a completely different global power. One whose primary interest in strengthening this partnership is unmistakable, containing the shared northern rival that dominates this entire rivalry. This is what officials in the region now openly call being multi-aligned rather than non-aligned, maintaining relationships with rival global powers simultaneously, treating alignment not as loyalty but as leverage, always keeping multiple options open rather than surrendering independence to any single patron. It's a strategy that works, right up until an outside power decides it no longer wants to tolerate the ambiguity. In recent years, that's exactly what's happened. A major global power grew increasingly frustrated with this country's continued economic relationship with its sanctioned partner, eventually imposing steep economic penalties specifically designed to force a choice. Tariffs stacked directly on top of existing trade measures, and a dramatic increase in fees affecting the enormous population of this country's citizens who travel abroad for work. A policy that struck an unusually personal financial nerve across millions of households. The response was almost instant and almost paradoxical. Rather than simply complying, the pressured country began publicly warming relations with the very northern rival at the center of this entire story, sending its top leadership to meet directly with counterparts from both its sanctioned energy partner and its border rival, appearing side by side in carefully staged displays of solidarity against outside pressure. But don't mistake that image for genuine trust. These are three governments with deep, unresolved historical grievances against one another, brought into a temporary transactional alignment by outside pressure rather than shared conviction. Even as this pressured country makes public gestures toward its rivals, it appears to be simultaneously working to preserve its deeper economic relationship with the power applying the pressure in the first place, searching for ways to keep its options open with everyone at once, rather than genuinely picking a side with anyone. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath everything this story has covered. A nuclear border where soldiers still fight with sticks because neither side can afford real war. A trade relationship so lopsided that one economy has become structurally dependent on the very neighbor it distrusts most. A struggle for control of an entire ocean fought through ports and naval bases rather than battles. And now, layered on top of all of it, a triangle of great power dependency that leaves one country perpetually unable to fully satisfy any of the forces pulling at it. Three vulnerabilities, pulling in three different directions, all converging on the same nation at once. Displease the economic giant to the north, and the domestic economy suffers immediately. Displease the longtime military supplier, and defense readiness weakens against the very rival on the border. Displease the emerging global partner, and decades of hard-won economic and strategic momentum could reverse overnight. There is no version of this triangle where all three relationships can be kept perfectly satisfied forever. Sooner or later, something has to give. And somewhere above all of it, at 17,000 feet, in temperatures that can kill an unprepared man in hours, a soldier is still standing at a line nobody has ever fully agreed on, holding a stick. Because that's still the only weapon either side trusts the other not to escalate. That contradiction, nuclear states settling their most dangerous disagreement with medieval weapons, isn't a strange historical footnote. It's the clearest possible symbol of everything this rivalry actually is. Two of the most powerful nations on Earth, bound together by fear, dependency, and unresolved history. Each one too afraid of the other to fight, and too afraid of the other to fully make peace.